to add this, and I strongly believe it should not be delayed in this bill. I hope members will listen. I hope they will respond. You know, hundreds of thousands of commuters are at risk until this system is put into place. I thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Kentucky.
Dependency often leads to insolence, indolence, lethargy, a sense of entitlement, and ultimately to a state of insolence. Egypt has been receiving welfare from the United States for nearly 40 years. America has lavished over $60 billion on the government of Egypt, and they react with insolence and disregard by detaining 19 of our U.S. citizens. For several months now, these citizens have been essentially held hostage, unable to leave Egypt, held on the pretense of trumped-up political charges, held in order to display them in show trials to placate the mob. The United States can respond in one of two ways. We can hang our head low. We can take the tack of Jimmy Carter. We can try to placate Egypt with concessions and offer them bribes in the form of more government aid. Or America can respond with strength. The President should today call the Egyptian ambassador in and send him home with a message that America will not tolerate any country holding U.S. citizens as political prisoners. Congress should act today to tell Egypt that we will no longer send our annual welfare check to them, that this year's $1.8 billion is not on the way. America could put Egyptian travelers on notice that the welcome sign in America will temporarily expire unless the Egyptian government lets our people go. Or America could hang her head, promise to continue the foreign aid to Egypt, and apologize for supporting democracy. Which will it be? So far, the signals sent to Egypt from the President and from the Senate have been weak or counterproductive. In late January, the President's Undersecretary of State said to the administration that he wanted to provide more immediate benefits to Egypt. Let's speed up the welfare checks. The President's budget this week still continues to include $1.8 billion for Egypt, without a single word of rebuke or any demand that our U.S. citizens be released. The President went one step further when he actually increased foreign aid to the Middle East in his budget. And now the Senate refuses to hold a single vote to spend 10 minutes discussing why U.S. citizens are being detained in Egypt. One might excuse the Egyptians for not believing that we will cut their aid. You can't lead from behind. Senate leadership appears unwilling to address this issue head-on, so the Senate won't act to help out our citizens this week. But I hope when senators return home, when senators talk to their constituents in their state, I hope that their constituents will ask these questions. Senator, why do you continue to send our taxpayer money to Egypt? Why do you continue to send our money to Egypt when they detain our citizens? Senator, why do you continue to send billions of dollars to Egypt when 12 million Americans are out of work? Senator, why do you continue to send welfare to foreign countries when our bridges are falling down and in desperate need of repair? Senator, how can you continue to flush our taxpayer money down a foreign drain when we are borrowing $40,000 a second? The money we send to Egypt, we must first borrow from China. That is an insanity, and it must end. And finally, Mr. Senator, I hope your constituents ask you this when you go home. When working families are suffering under rising food prices, when working families are suffering because gas prices have doubled, how can you justify sending our hard-earned taxpayer dollars to Egypt, to countries that openly show their disdain for us? When will we learn? You can't buy friendship, and you can't convince authoritarians to love freedom. with welfare checks. America needs to send a clear and unequivocal message to Egypt that we will not tolerate the detention of U.S. citizens on trumped-up political charges or otherwise, and that we will not continue to send welfare checks to Egypt, to a country that commits an injustice to American citizens. So, Mr. President, I ask today unanimous consent to set aside the pending amendment and call up my amendment on Egypt that would end all foreign aid to Egypt if our U.S. citizens are not released within 30 days. I think this is an important amendment, deserves discussion, and Egypt deserves to hear a message from the United States Senate that we will not tolerate this. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to bring up Amendment 1541.
Is there objection?
Madam President, reserving the right to object, I want to be very clear here.
The senator from California.
I want to be very clear here that members on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, have very strong feelings that this amendment should not be brought up at this time. We need to be smart and strategic when we have people in harm's way in another country. Now, further, I think it's important to note what Senator Leahy has said several times, which is already in law, we have certain conditions placed upon aid to Egypt, and I think that needs to be understood and explored. So I feel because there is so much objection to this amendment being brought up at this time, I will object.
Objection is heard.
Yes.
The senator from Iowa.
To ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business for about 15 minutes.
Without objection.
If a Republican like me, like this senator, says that the President's 2013 budget doesn't pass the smell test, I would probably have half the country questioning judgment. But I would like to quote Washington Post's Dana Milbank comments on the President's budget. This was recently in the Washington Post. These words by a columnist who I think generally is pretty favorable towards President Obama as a person and his administration. But there's great disagreement by this columnist about the President's budget. Quote, "The White House budget for fiscal 2013 begins with a broken promise, adds some phony policy assumptions, throws in a few rosy forecasts, and omits all kinds of painful decisions. Even then," the columnist continues, "the proposal would add $1 trillion more to the national debt than Obama contemplated just a few months ago." Dana Milbank added that the Obama budget, quote, "is a non-starter on Capitol Hill, where even Senate Democrats have no plans to take it up. It is, in other words, exactly what it was supposed to be, a campaign document," end of quote. So with that background from somebody who is not a member of Congress, not a Republican or Democrat, I don't know how they might be registered, I would like to give my views on the President's budget, but just so that people know that it isn't just Republicans that disagree with the President's budget. I think you could sum up the President's budget with 3 words that might say you're giving it a D grade, and probably most people would give it an F grade, but it'd be debt, deficit, distrust, and disaster. Too much spending, too much taxing, and too much debt. So this comes from the fact that earlier this week the President submitted as he has to every year, a budget proposal, and this budget proposal was all too predictable. It was predictable because it follows the same path as his previous three budgets. With breathtaking irresponsibility, the President's 2013 budget would expand the scope of government by spending more money, increase taxes on job creators, particularly small business, and continue on the path of enormous deficits and record debt. Deja vu. The President's budget proposal is supposed to be a serious document, a document that lays out the President's priorities along with the President's ideas on how to address our national fiscal and economic challenges. This budget fails those goals miserably. As a member of the Budget Committee, I've heard from numerous experts who come before that committee about the need for Congress and the President to get serious about fiscal cliff that we're approaching. We've had deficit commissions. You remember Simpson-Bowles as an example. We've had task forces, and we have had what we call gangs, gang of six senators trying to work things out, and other members of Congress. All of these who have all put forward deficit reduction plans. However, it's going to take more than a commission, and the President didn't even back the recommendations of his own commission a year ago. It's going to take more than task forces. It's going to take more than gangs of senators, because the single most important political and moral leader in America is whoever holds the presidency of the United States. And in this particular instance of this executive budget, that person and that document has failed to lead on this critical issue. And it doesn't matter how many commissions, how many task forces, and how many gangs of senators you have, without presidential participation, a problem as big as this country's national debt is never going to be solved. What President Obama put forward on Monday of this week is not a serious budget. As I said before, it's a political statement. The fact is, Americans are going to pay a heavy price for the President's unwillingness and inability to lead. While President Obama claims that his budget will create an American built to last, the only thing his budget builds are higher deficits and debt, a bigger, more intrusive government, and economic decline for future generations. And you want to remember that more important than the economic points of a budget is when you get a more intrusive government, the less economic and social freedom that people have. By nearly every fiscal measure, President Obama's budget makes matters much worse. Not only has the President chosen to ignore the looming fiscal catastrophe, he's chosen to continue course and even step on the accelerator. This year, the federal government will spend $3.8 trillion, equal to 24.1% of our GDP. During the past 60 years, we've averaged about 21% of GDP. So you quantify government growing dramatically from taking 21% out of the economy. That government spends. 535 members of Congress spend instead of 300 million Americans. And that's raised to 24.3%. Alarmingly, over the 10-year budget that we look ahead in the 2013 budget, this budget spending never gets below 22%, so forever they're growing government and detracting from individual freedom. The President intends to lock in historically high levels of spending, and don't take it from me, but it's right here in these budget documents that we've all been given this week. He's a big spender of other people's money. In dollar terms, spending goes up from $3.8 trillion this year to $5.8 trillion 2022. Over a 10-year period of time, this budget spends about $47 trillion, and during that period of time increases the national debt by $11 trillion. So it's clear that this document that the President gives to Congress under law is built to spend. President Obama's budget is also harmful to our fragile economy because it would impose 1 9/10 trillion tax dollars. And so I always go back to what I thought was a very wise decision that President Obama made about 2 or 3 weeks before he actually took the oath of office. During the campaign, he reminded everybody he wanted to raise taxes. But when he got to being sworn in, he looked at how bad the economy was. And he clearly said it's not too wise to raise taxes when you're in a recession. Well, maybe technically we aren't in a recession. But for the 8 3/10% of the American people that are unemployed, it's not just a recession, it's also a depression for each one of them. So since the unemployment rate stands at 8.3% and the President seems to be just fine this year compared to 3 years ago when he was sworn in, that hiking taxes is not going to be harmful to the economy. It's not going to be harmful to those 8 3/10% of the people that are unemployed from finding jobs. But it is going to be. So why is the President flip-flopped on this issue of whether or not you ought to increase taxes when people have such high unemployment rates? This tax increase will harm the economy and result in fewer job opportunities, particularly among the small business people that create or provide for 25% of the jobs in America and generally create 70% of the new jobs in our economy. That's where it's going to be really harmful. I recently asked Federal Reserve Chairman Bernanke about the prospects of a tax increase and the impact it would have on our economy. He indicated that a significant tax hike could slow the economy, slow the recovery. And in my question to him before the Budget Committee, I quoted the Congressional Budget Office that said unemployment would go up and the economy would grow less if we had this big tax increase that the President wants. The President has spent many hours speaking about helping our economy, investing in our future, and increasing economic opportunities for all Americans. While he is saying all those things that he's probably sincere about, but at the same time he doesn't put his actions where his words are, because he doesn't allow a pipeline to be built that will create 20,000 jobs right now and 110,000 indirect jobs connected with it. Now, if he gets his wish to hike taxes by 1 9/10 trillion, it will harm all Americans, further prolong this already 3-year slowdown, while growing an even larger, more intrusive federal government impinging upon personal liberties to a greater extent. Maybe the President's purpose is in imposing this huge tax increase as an effort to reduce the nation's debt. And that's probably what he would tell us, and he may really believe that, but unfortunately that's not what he has planned. He wants to spend every dollar. His budget leads to an additional, as I said before, $11 trillion increase in debt, national debt, over the next 10 years. Debt held by the public increases from 74% of our economy to 76% of our economy by the year 2022 at the end of this 10-year budget window. And you got to compare that to the historic average since World War II, and that was just 43% compared to where it is right now at 74.2, going up to 76%. If people believe that President Obama is putting us on a path to fiscal sustainability by tax increases, I'd suggest that they look at the annual deficits over the next 10 years. These deficits never drop below $575 billion and actually go up towards the end of his budget, rising to $704 billion by 2022. This budget puts America on the course of deficits and debt as far as the eye can see into the future. Additionally, the President took a pass on proposing any real changes to our entitlement programs, which are the real driver of future deficits and debt. And that's only part of it. The main part of it is you want to preserve Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid for future generations, because if we don't do something about it, it's not going to be preserved. Again, he's absent from the discussion when Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid comes up. He's offered no solution in this budget, even though the Simpson-Bowles Commission that he appointed, that he never endorsed their recommendations a year ago, and why he didn't endorse and trust the people that he put in place to get a solution to these problems, I don't know. But even the Simpson-Bowles Commission had solutions for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Further evidence that the President has chosen not to lead on these very, very difficult issues. President Obama has spoken a lot lately about the issue of fairness. President Obama believes that this type of budget with higher taxes, more borrowing, and enormous deficits and debt will bring about fairness. If the President is referring to sharing in our nation's economic decline, he's right. If he's talking about sharing in a Japanese-like prolonged period of stagflation, he is right. If he's talking about sharing in an economic collapse like the one going on in Greece, he's right. It may not be tomorrow, but all signs point down the road in those directions because based upon the national debts of those particular countries and where we're headed. The budget proposed by President Obama will have all Americans sharing in higher taxes, a larger, more intrusive government, less freedom, and deficits and debt that will lead to economic decline for future generations. We all know that the large budget deficit reduces national savings, leading to higher interest rates, more borrowing from abroad, and less domestic investment, which in turn would lower income growth in our country. This will hurt lower and middle class the most. The gains President Obama touts in his budget that he's delivering to the middle class will be dwarfed by the loss of economic activity caused by deficits and debt. This isn't a serious document. It's a political document. As evidenced by how out of touch this budget is, few of my Democratic colleagues have even acknowledged that President Obama even submitted a budget, much less defend it. I hope the Senate will have an opportunity to debate and vote upon President Obama's budget. Last year, we had such a vote. Last year, the President's budget was defeated in the Senate by a vote of 97-0. Not a single member of the President's party supported his budget. So when constituents ask me why you can't do something in a bipartisan way in Congress, and we do a lot in a bipartisan way that doesn't get the attention of the press, and so people are cynical about Congress being bipartisan, but I quote a 97-0 vote about whether the President or whether or not there's bipartisanship, and that's a vote against the President's budget. Every Republican and every Democrat agreed. Once again this year, if we ever get this to a vote, I predict that very few, if any, will support this budget. Quite frankly, it would be humorous if the consequences of inaction weren't so serious. We have a moral obligation to offer serious solutions for today and for future generations. The President's budget fails in this responsibility. He has chosen a politically expedient path rather than a responsible, forthright path. Our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will suffer as a result of this failure. And that suffering comes from this fact that for 9 generations of Americans, each generation, each succeeding generation has lived better than the previous generation. And a lot of Americans feel that that's not going to happen with the next generation. That would be a sad commentary. I yield the floor. And I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Kaka.
objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I ask, as I said, to speak as if in morning business for up to 10 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I was presiding earlier today before the senator from North Carolina was, and listened to Senator Boxer talk about the importance of this transportation bill, this highway bill, which is, I underscore. I also, this week, we've seen movement on extension of the payroll tax and tax cut, and unemployment benefits, two very important things with the doctor's fix, two very important things to keep our economy moving. And just made me think back what's happened in the last couple of years. And in 2009, when Senator Obama became President Obama, we were losing 800,000 jobs a month in the United States of America, 800,000 jobs a month. We know what was happening, especially to manufacturing and especially in states like the presiding officer's North Carolina and my state of Ohio. In fact, we had for 12 years, every single year for 12 years, from 1997 to 2009, we had lost manufacturing jobs every single year in Ohio and in the United States. But after President Obama took office, we passed the Recovery Act, we did some other things, the health care bill, all that. We've begun to see month after month after month of job growth. Not job growth that we want yet, not the kind of strong job growth we want. But for 21, 22 consecutive months, we've seen more manufacturing jobs than the month before, including my state of Ohio. More manufacturing jobs every single month than the preceding month for 20, 21, 22 months in a row. And why is that? There are a lot of reasons. Number one is we began to put the economy on track, no longer losing 800,000 jobs a month, instead gaining manufacturing jobs every month. The auto rescue has made a huge difference in states like Ohio, but really across the country as we've seen manufacturing take off. Coming out of every recession, what leads us out of recession typically is the auto industry in the Midwest and throughout the country. People are making cars, they're buying cars, they're all the economic activity generated from making a car and buying a car and running a car. And one of the untold stories, Madam President, is that in Toledo, Ohio, in northwest Ohio, near the Michigan border, the Jeep plant, the Chrysler Jeep plant, Chrysler, a company that was saved from the auto rescue, went into bankruptcy. The restructuring and the financing by U.S. taxpayers got that company back on its feet, back into business making cars. But prior to the auto rescue in 2008, the Chrysler plant and the Jeep plant in Toledo, only 50% of the products going into a Jeep, of the components assembled in that plant in Toledo, Ohio, only 50% were American-made. You know what happened now after the auto rescue? 75% of those products are American-made in those components, and that's exactly the point, because it's not just the companies you hear about. Honda's is a big operation in Ohio. Chrysler, GM, Ford, all big operations in Ohio, all expanding, all investing. Just in the last 6 months, each of those 4 companies has announced major investment dollars going into Ohio operations. It's not just those auto plants, it's the supply chain. So if a Chrysler Jeep is made out of 75% auto parts, American parts, rather than 50% American parts, think of the jobs that creates. Tires, steering wheels, locks, transmissions, the engine, the fenders, all the steel, all the electronics, all the products that go into those automobiles and trucks. And that, Madam President, is in many ways the untold story. Now, the problem, though, with that is that we're still seeing China, the People's Republic of China, Communist China, cheating when it comes to auto parts. The auto parts trade deficit a decade ago was about $1 billion, meaning that the U.S. companies bought $1 billion in Chinese-made auto parts more than we sold to China. Auto parts made in this country. We had a $1 billion deficit in auto parts. Today, that deficit is about 800% bigger than that. It's around $10 billion, that auto parts trade deficit. So, Madam President, the point of that is if we can turn that around, if we can force the Chinese to play fair and stand up and practice trade according to our national interests, not according to some economics textbook that's 20 years out of print, if we can do that, it will mean way more American jobs making auto components in steel and rubber and all those things that go into creation of an automobile, the assembly of an automobile and a truck. And Yesterday, just 100 feet from here, a group of us met with the Vice President of China, who will soon be the leader of that country. People predict, the people that know China well predict. And I asked him a question about that China doesn't play fair. They don't play fair in currency. They don't play fair when it comes to subsidizing energy and water and capital and land. And of course, he deflected the question. He didn't really answer it. I didn't expect him to, but I wanted him to know, as 8 or 9 of us were sitting around the table, I was the only one that really directly brought up the whole issue of trade and jobs and this economic relationship leveling the playing field. But that's why it is so important, Madam President, that the House of Representatives passed my China currency bill. This is legislation that the Senator from North Carolina has co-sponsored, Senator Hagan. It's legislation that Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, Republicans, co-sponsored. It's legislation that Chuck Schumer in New York has co-sponsored, along with a Democrat, along with Olympia Snowe, a Republican from Maine, and Debbie Stabenow, a Democrat from Michigan, and Senator Sessions, a Republican from Alabama. All of us have come together. It was the largest, my currency bill was the largest bipartisan jobs bill that the United States Senate passed in 2011, and unfortunately Speaker Boehner in the House of Representatives is blocking it, and it's important that he move on that. It will have a strong bipartisan vote out of the House of Representatives, as it did far in excess of 60 votes in the United States Senate. It will mean that it works like this, briefly, that with China cheating on currency, it means that a product made in Cleveland, Ohio, and sold in Wuhan, China, has a 25 minimum. Some Reagan administration former officials say 40 or 50%, but at least a 25% currency tariff or tax, that every one of our products is taxed that way. That cost is added to it when it's sold in China. Conversely, if the Chinese make something and sell it into Akron or Lima or Mansfield, Ohio, that product is 25% less expensive, which means that American companies can't really compete. There was a company in Brunswick. I was talking to the 2 brothers that run this company, and they were about to make $1 million sale, and all of a sudden a Chinese competitor came in with that 25% bonus that they get because China games and cheats on the currency system. They were underpriced by 20%. So that clearly doesn't work. That's why I said that to the Vice President of China about the importance of currency. It's why the House of Representatives needs to pass my legislation, and it will mean that we can keep this recovery going. The 21 months in a row of manufacturing job growth, coupled with the extension of the payroll tax cut, coupled with the extension of unemployment benefits, coupled with the transportation bill, the highway bill that Senator Boxer and Senator Inhofe bipartisanly are working on, coupled with the China standing up to the Chinese on trade enforcement and on this currency bill, will mean we're going to get this recovery. We're going to sustain it. We're going to grow it. It's going to mean significant new jobs in my state of Ohio and across the country. Madam President, I yield the floor and suggest you have a civil quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Coco.
Well, the pending business in the Senate is the 109 In the Senate today, members are working on the $109 billion surface transportation bill, and that is likely to be the main agenda item for the rest of the day. We'll hear general speeches sprinkled in. Senators at times coming to the floor to also make remarks about President Obama's budget, $3.8 trillion. The House in recess right now until 3 o'clock this afternoon. At that time, they will continue debating amendments to the oil shale leasing measure related to the surface transportation bill. There are at least 8 amendments to that bill and offshore oil and gas drilling legislation, too. Votes are expected at about 4:30 Eastern. The number of people filing for jobless benefits continues to fall. The government says first-time claims dropped 13,000 to a seasonally adjusted 348,000 last week. Other reports out today showing housing construction picked up in January, and wholesale prices also rose slightly.
The pending business on both the House and Senate floors today are separate transportation bills. In the Senate, it's a 2-year, $109 billion surface transportation bill. The Hill wrote this morning that Senator Reid, the majority leader, noted that a cloture motion on the pending highway bill will ripen Friday morning, and the Senate must vote on the payroll tax cut conference report as well as an Obama judicial nominee before leaving for a 10-day break. They're in a quorum call now, obviously. The House, meanwhile, comes back, we expect, about 3 o'clock Eastern to continue debate on the first part of the 5-year, $260 billion transportation bill. The first part deals with expanding oil and gas drilling as well as approving the Keystone XL pipeline. They worked their way through a number of amendments yesterday, more today, and likely a final passage vote as well. That's later today, again about 3 o'clock on C-SPAN.